Uses of the tenses in sequence. In this chapter, we're going to look at something called the sequence tense in Hebrew. Hebrew has two of them, a tense that you use in the past time, so past time narrative sequence, and one that you use for the future, a future time narrative sequence. Now these two sequences build on the perfect and the imperfect, so we couldn't discuss them until now that we've dealt with both of those other two. Now, when I talked about the imperfect in the last chapter, I mentioned that there is considerable scholarly debate as to how to really understand the perfect and the imperfect tense. There's even more scholarly debate as to how to understand these sequence tenses. And so what I want to do in this first module of this chapter is to give you a distilled version, the boiled down distilled version of how to understand these sequence tenses and how they relate to the perfect and the imperfect, something you should memorize. And then in the other modules in this chapter, I'm going to go into more detail. I'll give you examples. I'll talk about the historical development of the language of Hebrew itself, and also the historical development of the understanding of these sequences from the early Jewish medieval grammarians up to the present day. So let us talk about what these things really are. Let's give the introduction to it. So we have the perfect, which you looked at in chapter 10, and we have the imperfect, which you looked at in this last chapter, the one just before this. These are our non-sequential tenses, just the normal tenses that we've already examined. And I'm going to call the perfect tense the past here, and I'm going to call the imperfect the future. Now we know, because we've studied this, that the perfect you can translate as a simple past. You can also translate as a perfect or as a present. Likewise, the future is not just, or rather the imperfect, is not just a future. It can be translated as a future, but also as a continuing action, like a habitual or a customary, and it can also be translated as a modal. But for the purposes of these sequences, let's first think about them as past and future. Because what we're going to do is over here, I'm going to put our sequence tenses, and we have two of them, one for the past, one for the future. So we want to line it up this way. Now, how do these things work? What are they? What you do is rather interesting, actually, because what you do is you take the imperfect, you put it up here, and you add a special form of the vav called the vav consecutive. And that is your past tense narrative sequence, and it's related to the perfect. Generally what will happen, and I'll talk about this in the next module, is that your sequence will start with a perfect, and then it'll continue with a whole series of these, vav consecutive plus imperfects. And another one, then another one, and it can continue for quite a while. Conversely, for the future narrative sequence, you take the perfect and you put it with this special vav consecutive, and you get the future narrative sequence. So what we see here is a bit of a flip-flop. You take a past tense, or at least a tense that can be translated as the past, the perfect, and you add this special vav to it, and it becomes future. Likewise, you take the imperfect, something that can be translated as a future, you add this special vav to it, called the vav consecutive, and you get a past tense narrative sequence. What's going on? Well, I'll talk about what's going on later. But just to give a little bit of a hint here, there are other ways, there are other names for this vav consecutive, and one of them is vav conversive. And I'll go through 6 different names that people have given these, which gives you a hint as to how people have struggled with trying to understand this. But one of the first ones was the vav consecutive, or the vav conversive, because it looks like this special vav, whatever you want to call it, consecutive, conversive, whatever, it is converting the imperfect into a perfect. And here it's converting a perfect into an imperfect. So it's like it's inverting, and some even call it vav inversive. It is inverting or converting this into this. Now, that's probably not the best way to understand it, but it's understandable why a person would think that. We'll address that more in a moment, or in a module in the future. So we have this Vav consecutive. Now, the Vav consecutive is not the Vav conjunctive. The Vav conjunctive is the Vav that we've already seen. We introduced back in chapter 7, I think, or even before. That's the Vav we translate as and or but. Simple conjunction between two clauses, or two words even. The Vav consecutive is different. It has this special function for narrative sequences. So this is the one we use for narratives, and this is the one that's just the regular one, the conjunction. So how do we tell the difference? How do we tell when we're dealing with this versus this? Now, which should I start with? I'm going to actually start with the imperfect. In the imperfect, well, let me first do this. In the perfect and the perfect, the Vav conjunctive is just this. Just our regular Vav, right? And of course, remember that sometimes this will change a little bit. You'll get an U, for instance, before labials. You can go back to chapter 7 and take a look at how Vav, your regular Vav, changes before before weak letters or whatever. That's all material we've already covered. The real question is, what do these look like? Well, the Vav consecutive that attaches itself to the imperfect, go back here, so I'm talking about this one here with the imperfect, it looks like this. I'm going to put it down like this. So you have the Vav, that's the same, then we have a Patach, and we have a Dagesh in the following letter. So this one looks different than this. And this should look like something else we've seen, right? This has three parts: a letter, a Patach, and a Dagesh forte. Can you remember what has three parts that are analogous to this? Well, it's our article, right? Remember way back we looked at the article, and I emphasized it has three parts because people all seem to forget this, or students initially seem to forget this Dagesh. So this is analogous to this. Very similar. It's just the letter is different. So you can remember it that way. Now, unfortunately, when it comes to the perfect, the Vav looks the same as this one. The consecutive and the conjunctive Vav look the same when they're attached to the perfect. You can't tell the difference. There's no morphological difference. So it's a bit tricky. You have to go by context. Now, in a later module, I'll talk about accents. There's a bit of an accent shift that can happen in a couple of forms that will give you a hint that you're dealing with the Vav consecutive. But even that doesn't always happen. So, for the most part, you will be able to detect, let me go back to the screen here, with the perfect, you'll be able to detect that you have a Vav consecutive because of the context, because you'll see a chain happening. You'll have a future, and then it'll be obvious that this needs to be translated that way, as a Vav consecutive. With the past tense, the past time narrative sequence, the imperfect plus Vav consecutive, however, we have this. Okay? Do not forget that. This is very important. We have this three-piece Vav, special one. With the perfect, we just have the regular one. Okay, I think I have a chart here. Here is the imperfect plus Vav consecutive, the one with the three parts to it. In fact, I'll just go right to this one. So here I've highlighted them. We see the Vav. Well, first of all, if you ignore the green and the red, what we have here is just the plain old imperfect. Okay? We have a prefix here, and here, and here, and here, and here, all the way down, the same in here in our suffixes. All you do to make the sequence tense is you add this special Vav to it. Vav, Patach, and Dagesh in the Yud, or in the Tav, or in whatever that Nun, whatever that prefix is. Now, just like with the article, remember the article also has this Dagesh forte. You can't double certain things like gutturals, and here we have a guttural, and you can't double it, so this lengthens from a Patach to a Kametz. Compensatory lengthening because you can't double. No big surprise. We've seen that a million times. Just remember, though, that Patach or sorry, that comments is there for the 1CS form. So this is what the imperfect plus the vav consecutive looks like. I don't have a chart here for the perfect plus vav consecutive because all it is, you just add the vav in front. Actually, I'll just write one here for you. So pakad, that's our 3ms perfect, right? If you want to add, you put it here. And again, it's only context that'll tell you, is this a vav consecutive or a vav conjunctive? But all you do is just slap it on. It doesn't change this at all. With this one, you have to add the dagesh, and you put this vowel under it. Okay. Yes, the last thing I want to talk about, and then I'll show you my big chart. Not the big chart, but the chart that you need to memorize. We want to talk about the preterite. What Ross does here is he describes it just as I have here, using this term, vav consecutive, but he calls this a preterite. Okay? So instead of having the imperfect here for the past time narrative sequence, he has something called the preterite. Now, why does he go from imperfect to preterite? Well, I'm going to have a module looking at the historical development of the language, and I'll talk about why they think there's a preterite here. But briefly, it appears that, in fact, this is not an imperfect at all. This is a different verb that happens to look like the imperfect. And historically, before biblical Hebrew, before the stage of Hebrew that we have in the text today, before that time, there were two tenses, and they were different, and they merged, and they looked the same. So, at first glance, it looks like you have an imperfect plus a vav consecutive, but in fact, through historical analysis and looking at other Semitic languages, scholars are pretty much concluded that, in fact, it's something different. It's a preterite. Now, what does preterite mean? Preterite simply means past tense. And Ross wants us to use preterite here to remind us that, in fact, this is not the imperfect. This is a preterite. It's a different verb form that happens to look the same. So, this is what you need to memorize. And so I'm going to put my little green thing here. Now, at this point, you don't have any examples. I haven't given you examples yet, so it may not make a lot of sense. But once you've gone and you've done the other modules, seen the examples, worked through exercises, whatever, this is what you want to come back to. And I guess I should add here. Should have put this in somehow. Make it a little neater. That's what those vav consecutives look like. For the preterite, it's this three-piece vav consecutive. And for the perfect, there's no distinction between the vav consecutive and the vav conjunctive in terms of their morphology. They look the same. So that's the basic chart. And next we'll turn to a more detailed discussion of the sequence tenses.